A move that unfolded not over weeks, not over months, but in just 48 hours. 48 hours that changed the battlefield calculus. 48 hours that exposed Moscow's hidden hand. 48 hours that triggered one of the most precise military responses we have seen in this entire conflict. What Moscow did this week crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with speed, and with devastating accuracy. This is the story of how the CIA uncovered a secret Russian operation, how that intelligence reached Kyiv in record time, and how Ukraine turned that information into action before Moscow could complete what it started. It is a story about what happens when intelligence meets execution, and tonight we have the details. For several weeks now there had been signals, not official briefings, not diplomatic warnings, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unusual in scope and intent. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a logic that analysts in Langley and across European intelligence agencies had learned to anticipate. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this month was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence officials who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators, the unusual movement of specialized units, the sudden increase in encrypted communications, the repositioning of logistics assets to forward positions, the sudden quiet across previously active command channels. All of that went quiet. And whenever Moscow goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Senior officials at the CIA began tracking what they internally described as pattern deviation, a term used when an adversary's behavior no longer fits established models. This deviation first appeared in satellite imagery showing movements near staging areas that had been dormant for months. Equipment that had been stored was being activated. Personnel who had been in rear positions were being moved forward under cover of darkness. Something was happening, and Washington needed to know what. Early Tuesday morning, CIA analysts detected what they described as coordinated repositioning of strategic assets, including mobile radar systems and electronic warfare units that had not been deployed in over 8 months. These are the kinds of assets that Moscow only activates when they are signaling something very specific, a major offensive push, a defensive fortification of newly occupied territory, or preparation for a high-value strike operation. Intelligence officers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Moscow was changing its operational posture, and when a military power of Russia's scale shifts posture without explanation, even by small increments, every Allied intelligence service pays attention. What followed was a flurry of activity across the intelligence community. The National Security Agency began intercepting communications that suggested coordination between Russian ground forces and elements that analysts had previously identified as being involved in covert operations. The Defense Intelligence Agency noted changes in supply chain patterns that were inconsistent with normal rotation schedules. And then came the breakthrough. A source with access to Russian military planning, the details of whom remain classified, provided confirmation of what satellites and signals intelligence had suggested. Moscow was preparing a secret operation designed to establish a new forward presence in a region that Ukraine had recently contested. The operation was not just tactical, it was strategic, and it was already underway. The warning issued by the CIA to Allied partners was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials briefing congressional leadership described Moscow's move as calculated, accelerated, and perhaps most importantly designed to be completed before Ukraine or its allies could respond. But that strategy only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated and effective we have seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 12 hours of receiving the intelligence, Ukrainian forces began repositioning assets across 3 operational zones. These weren't the standard defensive adjustments. These were precision strike packages, systems and units that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to neutralize high-value targets before they become operational threats. The speed of the response caught many observers off guard. Normally, translating intelligence into military action requires days of planning, coordination, and verification, but Ukraine's military command had been preparing for exactly this scenario. They had contingency plans in place, they had assets pre-positioned, and when the call came from Kyiv, they moved. Tonight, multiple defense sources confirmed that Ukraine launched precision strikes on Russian forward positions, including a command node that had recently been activated for what analysts believe was coordination of the secret operation. Ukraine struck before Moscow could consolidate. They hit communication relay stations that were being used to coordinate troop movements. They hit logistics depots that had just received fresh supplies of ammunition and fuel. They hit electronic warfare platforms that were likely preparing to jam Ukrainian reconnaissance systems. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of the operation, the command structure that would have made it functional. This is what made the CIA's warning so urgent. Moscow's operation wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could shift the balance of control in a contested region if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't launch broad attacks across the front line. They didn't waste munitions on secondary targets. They hit the command nodes. They hit the supply lines. They targeted the infrastructure that would have allowed the operation to succeed. Western officials who spoke on condition of anonymity described the Ukrainian response as textbook execution of intelligence-driven warfare. One official noted that the time between receiving actionable intelligence and launching the first strike was among the shortest on record for operations of this complexity. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Moscow's latest move was designed to test the responsiveness of Ukrainian forces and their Western partners after months of battlefield attrition. Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine would detect the operation in time. They wanted to see whether Western intelligence would share critical information quickly enough to matter. They wanted to see whether Ukraine had the capability and the will to respond before Russian forces could dig in. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't hesitate, the CIA didn't delay. The response was so swift, so coordinated, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Moscow's shift as operational probing, a way to identify weaknesses in the intelligence sharing pipeline between Ukraine and its allies. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and connected. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse or conceal their assets. That timing matters because it shows the intelligence pipeline is working. It shows that Ukraine is not simply receiving information. They are acting on it in real time. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force assets carried out strikes on at least 4 identified positions, forcing Russian units to abandon equipment and retreat to secondary locations. Ground-based missile units targeted a radar installation that had been upgraded in the last 72 hours. Special operations forces operating behind the front line reportedly disabled communication equipment used by Russian commanders to coordinate with units involved in the secret operation. This wasn't just a tactical response. This wasn't just a defensive measure. This was strategic disruption. This was operational dominance. And operational dominance is the one thing Moscow has struggled to maintain since the early months of the conflict. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their ability to hold, supply, or reinforce. Tonight was no different. In fact, tonight may have been the clearest example yet of how effective the intelligence partnership between Ukraine and its Western allies has become. Remember, Moscow thought Ukraine would collapse in days. They thought Western support would fracture under economic pressure. They thought fatigue would erode the will of both Ukrainians and their allies. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking faster than ever. Western intelligence is reaching Kyiv in near real time, and Moscow's secret operations are being exposed before they can achieve their objectives. This is not the war Russia expected to fight. And with each passing month, the gap between their expectations and reality grows wider. What makes this moment so critical and so revealing is that Moscow's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under enormous internal pressure. Military hardliners want faster results on the battlefield. Economic advisors want reduced spending on a conflict that has drained resources. Political allies want visible victories they can use to justify continued support. And international partners want reassurance that their investment in the Russian war effort will produce outcomes. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a military that has suffered significant losses and a population that is growing weary of sacrifice. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. Tonight's failed operation will not make those pressures any easier to manage. The CIA's assessment, now shared with key allies and select congressional leaders, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Moscow to change the battlefield through covert operations undetected. Officials said plainly that Russia's action was inconsistent with any claim of defensive posturing. That is diplomatic language for, we know what you're doing and we're not going to let it happen. You don't usually hear that tone from Langley unless something serious is at stake, and tonight something clearly was. The intelligence community's willingness to share this assessment so quickly and to allow it to be reported suggests they want Moscow to know that the element of surprise has been neutralized. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation and the world in a measured but determined speech tonight. He said, "We will not wait for threats to become attacks. We will act when we see danger forming." He said, our partners have given us eyes. Our soldiers have given us strength. Together, we see everything. And he said, to those who plan operations against us in secret, know this: there are no secrets we cannot uncover and no plans we cannot disrupt. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Moscow's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the repositioning of military assets, Russian cyber units also increased activity against Ukrainian infrastructure systems. Naval forces in the Black Sea adjusted patrol patterns in ways consistent with preparation for increased operational tempo. Proxy channels increased propaganda output targeting European audiences with messages designed to undermine support for Ukraine. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Moscow moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. And tonight, we may have only seen the first phase. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Moscow is preparing for a renewed offensive push before winter weather limits operational flexibility. Another is that Moscow is attempting to establish new defensive positions to protect recent territorial gains from Ukrainian counteroffensives. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Moscow is attempting to create a fait accompli in contested territory, establishing facts on the ground before any diplomatic process can begin. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for the operation to be completed. They didn't defer to diplomatic channels. They didn't hope the threat would resolve itself. They struck with precision and eliminated the threat before it could mature. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Moscow wants to see whether Ukraine can sustain this level of responsiveness. Ukraine wants to show that it can detect and neutralize threats faster than Russia can create them. Washington wants to prevent any escalation that could draw NATO into direct conflict. and European capitals want to prevent the conflict from expanding beyond Ukraine's borders. All of these interests are now converging on a single question: what comes next? Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian force posture for any signs of retaliation or adjustment. They say there is evidence of confusion in Russian command channels following the Ukrainian strikes. They say logistics units that were moving forward have halted in place, and they say Moscow's decision to accelerate this operation is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test Western cohesion before the end of the year. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, rapid, coordinated, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that covert operations will not succeed, and it sent a message to Washington that the intelligence partnership is delivering results. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Moscow hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that the CIA's warning was timely. It gave Ukraine the information they needed, it gave them the time they needed, and it allowed them to act before the threat could become reality. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase. If they pause to reassess, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared for whatever comes. They have shown they are ready to respond, and they have shown that the partnership between Kyiv and Washington is stronger than Moscow calculated. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet, and when Moscow is quiet, it means they are thinking. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have been forced to learn repeatedly since this conflict began. Ukraine will not wait to be attacked. Western intelligence will reach Kyiv in time to matter, and every secret operation Moscow launches will be met with a response they did not anticipate. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The CIA's warning worked, Ukraine's response was decisive, and Moscow's secret operation failed before it could begin. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.